Welcome to YOUCANIC. Today here on YOUCANIC we have a 2019 Chevy Trax. And on this Chevy Trax we are going to go over how you'd replace your front brakes and rotor. So first you'll jack up the vehicle and support it with jack stands and then be able to remove the front tire. I have turned the steering to the right because we are working on the right side, which is your passenger side. And then that gives us easier access to the bolts that we need to remove. We got two size 14 bolts here that will remove the caliper from the carrier, and then we got two size 18 bolts behind that hold the carrier to the hub assembly, and then also we'll go over how you remove this rotor to be able to replace it if you're replacing it with a new one. This rotor is in fairly good shape, and so we are just going to replace the brakes per se, and we'll go over the process to replace the rotor. So to start with, we're going to want some space between the brake pads and the rotor so that we can get this to pull apart. So we'll just use a screwdriver in there and we can be able to depress the caliper a little bit, and you might be able to get enough in there. It's not always that you can get enough reach in there and be able to depress the whole caliper cylinder. And that way we don't even need to use a caliper press or anything to push that back. So now we've got that depressed, we can go ahead and undo the size 14 bolts. And these came undone, but sometimes you may need to put another wrench or pliers to be able to get the, because they'll spin. Alright, so now we can go ahead and raise this up, and then we have our caliper, and we're going to want to set it up here or hang it and put as little tension on our brake line as we can. Okay, so we've got that, so we'll go ahead and pop the brake pads off. And then we'll pop the shims off because we have new shims to put on. And while we're at it, while this is still attached, this is an easy time to be able to just go ahead and remove these glide pins, and we're going to clean off the grease. And then put fresh grease on, brake caliper grease, which is a high temp grease designed specifically for the brake calipers. And so put some new grease on there, and then I like to spin it as I put it in so that it coats all the way around. Do the same with the top one. Pull that out, clean it off. Alright, put some fresh brake caliper grease on there, and now be able to reinsert and put that in. Now, so we need to take off the carrier to be able to replace the rotor. And so we'll undo these two size 18 bolts. That way we can take off the carrier to be able to get the rotor off. So the carrier's been removed. Do a visual. We've got a little bit more corrosion on the bottom here, but we'll just clean that off with a wire brush so that when we put the guide pins or the shims back in, or the new shims, we're not getting any tighter clearances than what it should have came from with the factory. So now we need to remove this rotor to be able to replace the rotor. So to do that, because this one has a screw, not all have the screws, but this one does, we're going to loosen this. Sometimes these screws can be a pain, or you'll break them off. It's not a big issue. If you break them off, they're just there to hold the rotor to the hub so that it doesn't flop around while you're working on it. So now we'll take our rotor. You may have to use persuasion of a hammer sometimes because you'll have too much corrosion inside here. This one we don't actually have that much corrosion, so it came off fairly nice. Alright, so we are reusing the old rotor. Looks pretty good shape. There's a lot of surface rust on here, but that's just from the fact of the vehicle being not driven for quite a while, and so it gets that rust from the rain splashing up and getting on the rotor. I recommend that you generally always replace rotors and brakes at the same time, or for sure get them spun, but there's not a whole lot of places that do that anymore, so you just buy a new rotor. Anyway, so you would take your new rotor and just be able to reinstall. Now if you have the screw, you're going to want to make sure that you line it back up so that you can put that screw in to hold it on. Now if the screw is broken or missing, it's not a huge deal, because you can just use a lug, one of the lug nuts, to hold this on, and then that way it won't be flopping around when you're trying to put the carrier back on and the caliper. Okay. So we've got that mounted and attached, and we're good to go. It's just brake cleaner to clean off any of the oil residue that may or may not be on your brake rotor, especially if this is a brand new rotor, when they come with a coating of an oil residue so that they don't rust in shipping. So you'll want to make sure that you do that to clean the rotor off. We'll take our carrier and be able to install that. Alright, so carrier's on, good and tight. Now, with our brake kit, we have new shims to put on. And so we need to put our new shims on by orientating them the right way, and which is just to line up with this tab bent down away from the brakes. And then the way it's held in, it's these little metal clips hold it in. So you just got to get it kind of lined up in there, and either depress if you can with your hand, or just a screwdriver. Yep. Our key is just to have it all in there good and snug. Same thing with the top one. Okay, so we have those in. Now we'll need to put the brake pads on. So we have our brake pads, and we have a wear sensor. That wear sensor is to alert you when your brakes have worn down. And see, when it hits, you still have a little bit of brake pad left, but it's going to make a fairly awful noise when you hit the brakes, because what that does is it's going to scrape along the rotor as you're hitting the brakes, and it's going to cause a very loud noise. And so that way you'll know that it's definitely time to replace your brakes. Thing is, you have your kit will have 4 pads in it, but you're going to have only 2 that have the wear sensor on it, and you want to keep the wear sensor toward the top and on the inside of the rotor. I'm going to take a little bit of the brake grease, put a teeny bit on the slide there, and then be able to line it up and install it there. Do the same on the outside. very little there, and then we can put a teeny bit where the caliper handles will grip onto this. It provides a little bit of adhesion, and your brakes won't be chattering. Okay, so we've got our brake pads installed, and then the last thing, we're going to take a little bit of that grease. I'm just going to put a teeny bit here on the just that metal part of the caliper. I'll try the best, and then that way we have a little bit that's going to apply when you hit the brakes on the back of the brake pad there, and again provide you some adhesion to not have your brakes chattering around. Install our size 14 bolts that hold the caliper to the carrier, and I'm going to tighten those. Okay, and they may spin sometimes depending on how much resistance you have in that bolt, and so you may need to put a wrench on inside here to be able to hold the tightness, but you don't need to. So this same procedure you would repeat for the other side, and so that's how you replace your front brakes and rotors on your Chevy Trax. And also, when you're done, you'll put the tires on, lower the vehicle, torque them to spec, and you want to make sure that you pump the brake pedal a couple times to make sure that this caliper is very close, or it is pressing against the brake pad, and all of the slack inside here has been taken out. And then, so when you go to drive down the road, your vehicle's actually going to stop for you. Thanks for watching YOUCANIC, where you can be the mechanic.